Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Professor Klooster, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to talk about your article that I have to come across, The Rising Expectations of Free and Enslaved Blacks in the Greater Caribbean. And so before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Okay, I am a Dutch national who moved to the United States after finishing my PhD. And ever since, this is 1995, I've lived in the United States. I've taught at the University in Maine, and I have been at Clark University since 2003, where most of what I do is Atlantic history.
Mm-hmm.
And I have published quite extensively on the Dutch colonial empire, on smuggling, especially in the Caribbean. And in the last 15 to 20 years, especially on the age of revolutions.
Perfect. No, thank you so much. So we'll start, and your article situates the 1790s as a transformative period across the Greater Caribbean. How did events like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen and the 1795 slave results reshape expectations among both free and enslaved Black populations?
Yes, I find the 1790s fascinating, both in Europe and in the Americas, and specifically in the Greater Caribbean. So not just the Caribbean islands, but also the surrounding areas, including Venezuela and what we now call Colombia. So it has a lot to do with the French Revolution in 1789, but it is not just the French Revolution. I see the 1790s as a period in which we find a confluence of different themes, different movements, different laws and constitutions in Europe. For instance, we have in 1789 not just the French Revolution, but also a new slave code that is adopted for the Spanish colonies,
Mm-hmm.
Which in itself doesn't mean too much good news for the slave populations of the Spanish colonies. The situation gets perhaps a little better in terms of the amount of whippings or the amount of working time. But in itself, the changes are not dramatic. But the idea that the Spanish king who signed this code is actually looking into slavery, that in itself gives hope to both free people of color and the enslaved populations of the Spanish colony. So that is one theme. Another one is British abolitionism, which got underway in the 1780s. And there are echoes, and I can talk about that a little later perhaps, there are echoes of the debates in English Parliament and of the activities of the abolitionists in England, echoes in the English newspapers. Those newspapers appear in the Americas. That in itself also gives slaves, not just in the British colony, but across the region, hope, because of the interconnectedness of the area, and I can talk about it later too. On top of that, then you have the French Revolution, which almost immediately, just about 6 weeks later, leads to this really remarkable document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which in many ways is a starting point of what we now call human rights. There is a clear arc that begins there and that ends with the UN, the United Nations Charter. And what it emphasizes is liberty, but especially equality. And the idea that this is a universal value that should be introduced everywhere. So the language of the French Declaration is universal. It should apply everywhere. At the same time, and this may be interesting too for your listeners, it is not very specific because it's so general, so generic in its statement about the application. And therefore, once Haiti is independent, what is interesting when you look at the Haitian constitutions, it keeps in the first constitution of 1801 that Toussaint Louverture wrote, but in independent Haiti later on as well, we have sentences like, there cannot exist slaves within the territory of the republic. Slavery is forever abolished. Toussaint Louverture had written that the abolition of slavery is guaranteed in this territory. So they make it very clear that it is abolished here and now. So there was perhaps a problem they'd had with this very general language because whoever wrote it could never be pinned down and told, well, please give us what you promised. But in itself, it does add to these rising expectations from the perspective of people who for many generations have been enslaved, have lived, in the case of the free people of color, with all kinds of legal disabilities. The idea that there is movement in Europe means that an opening is created, and they use that opening whenever they can.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Because I mean, I'll just say from my personal experience in terms of researching my family tree, the 1790s definitely, there was a lot going on. There's a lot that was happening, especially with the law, uh, depending on which Caribbean island that you're looking at. But my next question is in regards to Saint Domingue, where
Mhm.
enslaved people actively invoked the language of rights and citizenship. How significant was this adaptation of revolutionary language, as you mentioned before in the previous answer, in reshaping resistance and political claims?
It's very interesting, both when you look at Saint Domingue, but also when you look at other parts of the Greater Caribbean, where before the revolution, um, even illiterate people who lived a horrible life of slavery, even free people of color who were usually, of course, born illiterate. In the ancien regime, in the old regime, before the revolutionary period, before the 1790s, have often mastered the kind of language that you need to master to write a successful petition. So you emphasize the values of the old regime, of this very hierarchical regime, which means you emphasize honor and you emphasize you're a good Catholic, or you have a decent position, a decent job, and you are a devoted husband, etc., etc. That then changes very quickly, and you can even see that a little earlier during the early stages of the American Revolution, before the actual war with Britain breaks out in the 1770s. There are petitions presented to the authorities right here where I am in New England, in Boston, where the vocabulary that had grown among the patriots in the battle with the English Parliament and increasingly with the English King, those terms had already been imbibed by uh, the black petitioners who came to the authorities, who very logically bring up, for instance, the question, well, you are talking about being enslaved by England. Well, here you have some actual slaves. We know really what we're talking about. But they
Mhm.
go beyond that, and they emphasize some of the values of the American Revolution, because the American Revolution, of course, at the end of the day, I think, like the French Revolution, one of the main historical legacies of those
Mhm.
revolutions is that equality before the law was achieved. Well, if the revolutionaries are serious about it, they should extend it, obviously, to everybody, and that's not what's happening. So they use the language of equality as well as the language of liberty. And in the Caribbean, you find that among very early on among the rebels, the slave rebels around people like Toussaint Louverture, It's interesting to see, though, that we should be very careful in analyzing what they appeal to. So some historians have said, when you look at what the slave leaders in Saint Domingue mention when they are debating issues with the authorities sent from France, it is not just this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They often keep going back to a very old document, a 1685 document, which is the Code Noir, the Black Code for the French colonies that was signed by the famous King Louis XIV, which gives them sometimes better handles on appealing to existing inequity. So this Code Noir specifically, for instance, calls for an end to arbitrary cruelty, just to mention something. That, of course, is not in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is quite general in its language. What's also interesting is that while I'm speaking about this particular time period, so just a few months into the Haitian Revolution, which begins in August 1791 in the north, but a few months into it, the leaders of the revolt, including Toussaint Louverture, go to the authorities, and what they ask for is not yet the end of all slavery. That, of course, to us makes sense. We analyze slavery as a system, but it's very hard when you're in the system, whether you are, let's say, a peasant in feudalism in Europe in the Middle Ages or the early modern period, or whether you find yourself exploited by plantation owners anywhere in the Americas, to see this all as an enormous system. What we usually see, and this is, I think, quite common in the history of slavery, is that people ask for freedom for themselves and their followers. And that's what these Haitians do as well. They say, well, we can end our uprising if we are guaranteed freedom for ourselves and our families and amnesty for all our followers. We will then make everybody go back to their plantations. But the language that they're using while they are negotiating with the authorities is often still a mixture of the kind of documents and the kind of arguments they would have used before the revolution and these new revolutionary ideals.
No, thank you. And, your work highlights Curacao as a deeply connected to French, Spanish, British, and even Louisiana networks. How did these trans-imperial connections influence political ideas and actions on the island?
It is interesting, and I've studied Curacao quite a bit, and through my research and my reading, I've come across many Curaçaoans, non-white Curaçaoans, who either temporarily or definitively, spent time in other parts of the Greater Caribbean. I think one aspect that sets apart Curacao is that it had a very large merchant navy and that there was a very conspicuously large number of people who were still formerly enslaved, but who either temporarily had been granted some freedom of movement on board these ships, or had borrowed documents which said they were free people of color, but thereby were able to travel. So if slavery is a spectrum, and on the extreme end of exploitation is plantation slavery, and perhaps the most extreme end would be plantation slavery on sugar plantation. I think under the conditions of slavery, the elbow room that you had the room to maneuver was probably larger as a sailor.
Mm-hmm.
As a sailor, you would be able to go from one locale to another, because Curacao was connected to the Spanish colonies, to the French colonies, to the English colonies. It was a very easy way to connect yourself to Saint Domingue, especially the southern coast of Saint Domingue, which was an interesting coast because this was not where the sugar plantations were found. This was not where many coffee plantations were found. This is where indigo was grown. Indigo was grown often by free people of color. who themselves were slave owners. And that's a complicated issue. I can
Yes.
go into that perhaps.
Yeah.
If you want, I can go into that as well. But um, perhaps after what I'm saying now. But these Curaçaoans you find in slave revolt, in the slave revolt in Louisiana, there's a
Mhm.
Curaçaoan man who plays a prominent. I think what sets them apart was the fact that they often would have been to many places and having traveled to many places would have been privy to whatever rumors were circulating there or whatever news was circulating there. Rumors are, for people in the early modern period, the main form of information,
Mhm.
almost for everybody. What reliable information was there? Even in today's world, you can wonder what kind of reliable information is out there. And in those days, people, did not have the luxury to be able to distinguish between which rumor was true and which was not true. Many rumors turned out to be true. And it's often a corruption of the news that had arrived. So let me give you an example. And this is not specifically to Curacao, but it just comes to mind. There's a slave revolt in Martinique. I believe it was just a few months after the start of the French Revolution. And the news of the French Revolution probably hadn't arrived even in Martinique. What sets off this revolt is probably newspaper reports about British abolitionism, about debates in Britain to at least abolish the slave trade. But that sets in motion a whole chain of thoughts, probably among people who toil every day on plantations. If you are on a remote plantation, which would have been the case, for instance, in Brazil, in Jamaica, would also have been more likely that you were detached from urban life, not in Curacao, where half of the population of Willemstad, the city in Curacao, was enslaved. But um, you would be exposed to that news, and Curaçaoans, by moving around so much, would be exposed to at least a version of what was in that
Mhm.
newspaper. And the way they interpreted it, I can talk about it a little later, is perhaps different from the way we might imagine they interpreted it. But if you travel around long enough, you find people who are willing to tell you what is going on in Europe. That would be sailors that arrive from Europe. You are in an inn, in a pub next to those sailors. They will, after a few glasses, tell you what's going on. Sometimes they might exaggerate, sometimes they might extrapolate. But you do have more of an idea of what's going on in the world than if you were, as most people on Brazilian slave plantation, would never be able to travel anywhere, never go to a town. So you would be among your fellow slaves, and you would only have limited contacts even with free people of color, let alone with white people who were the ones who were privileged enough to know at least about something going on in the wider world. There's also a theory about, let's say, people who worked in the household as domestic servants in the condition of slaves. And they would sometimes then eavesdrop or overhear conversations between their masters and whatever other members of the plantocracy of the planter class were around. And it's clear that these white elites, who were often quite paranoid, were very anxious about the news coming from Europe, especially in this period in the 1790s, between the French Revolution and the laws adopted in the French Convention, even before the abolition of slavery, of allowing more freedoms for free people of color in the French colonies. On top of that, the reformism in the Spanish colonies, abolitionism in England, it was all bad news. And usually what's bad news for the planter class means good news for the class of the slaves.
And let's just continue with that line of talk in terms of with the rumors, like because you discussed this in your paper. It was rumors were widely circulated during this period. How did, I guess, rumors really shape the perceptions of these mobilized communities, or even destabilize colonial authorities?
So I believe that rumors informed everybody's behavior all the time. It's actually precisely the same in the French Revolution. It's a great book about rumors in the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, I'll make the transition to the enslaved in the Caribbean soon. But in the French Revolution, one idea that dates back from well before the French Revolution, perhaps even more than 100 years before, is this belief among ordinary Frenchmen, peasants, people who were barely making a living in the cities, that there is a conspiracy of the aristocrats, and the conspiracy consists in starving us. These are evil people. They don't mean to have us lead good lives at all. And when, let's say, there's a shortage of grain, and especially urban populations are very dependent on the arrival of grain from the countryside, this rumor very quickly tends to go around.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think one idea that was an idea that was very widespread among slave populations in the Americas, and I've written a whole article about this, is that the king is, or it could be the queen, is a good person, and he or she has actually decided, after finally finding out about our plight, about our fate, has finally decided to overrule the evil advisors and set us free. In practice, though, nothing is happening, and that means that our masters, the authorities in town, are doing everything to thwart this decision, to prevent us from achieving our legal freedom. So this rumor you find everywhere, and also in the 1790s. And I've looked at one particular revolt in Colombia, and the interesting thing is that it's not as if everybody hears the rumor from the same source, because many of the ringleaders are interrogated, and they mention names, and then those people are interrogated. And it seems that there were four completely separate sources where this rumor started. Whether it started originally there, it's hard to say. But I have the feeling that on the one hand, you had, of course, and I mentioned these inns, these pubs, which you find all over the place, like in Port Royal in Jamaica. It's every third house, I think, was a pub, and there you often have a mixture of people of different ethnicities. So you have white sailors who, because simply of the fact that they have often arrived from other ports or from Europe, have some information. They might spread some ideas which are misinterpreted, but I have the feeling that there was always a group of people in any slave community, whether it's a plantation or a particular part of town where urban slavery existed, where people are convinced that our fate is not just undeserved, it's illegal. And it's illegal because if any monarchical figure, and Africans, were enslaved, tended to come from monarchies in Africa, the monarchical figure is a source of justice. And that would be confirmed if they ever came to a court of law where they would see the portrait of the king or the queen. What's interesting is that they do not just believe necessarily that it is the European king who has set them free. There are rumors in Saint Domingue about the king of Congo. Many of the Africans in Saint Domingue were Congolese, had come from the southwest of Africa. There is, among slaves in Martinique, twice the rumor that the Queen of Angola is coming, and she is going to liberate us all and bring us back to Africa. So this idea is very different from the 1790s, because the 1790s we think of as a time of republicanism, when the French Revolution gets rid of its king, establishes a republic. There are republics all of a sudden all over Europe, in Switzerland and in northern Italy. But the worldview of many Africans who were shipped as against their will and then exploited on these plantations and elsewhere. Their worldview was probably often, because they'd been brought usually not as children, but as teenagers or young adults. Their worldview, of course, was still to a large extent African and therefore often monarchical. That's how they made sense of the world. And when they then hear about these revolutionary activities in Europe, it's very easy for them to put two and two together and say, well, we hear a lot about troubles with the king, and that can only mean that the king is finally looking into the main problem that we are facing, and that is our enslavement. So that's one particular take on it. I'm not saying that this is
Yeah.
how all Africans in the Americas
Mhm.
interpreted their fate, but it's just one filter through which they see the world.
Yeah. No, and it's a good one to kind of look at something in that lens. And we're now going to go to like the free people of color who increasingly use the courts to demand recognition and rights. What kind of legal arguments were they making, and how effective were these strategies compared to other forms of resistance?
Yes, there's been a lot of research in last 15 years, I would say, on people of African descent in courts in the Americas. There's a wonderful book about colonial Mexico, which is not a place where we might
Mm.
naturally turn when we think of Africans in the Americas. But the author of this book has shown that in colonial Mexico, um, disputes between slaves and masters often lead to court cases in which, not in a majority of the cases, but in a remarkable number of the cases, it's the slaves that win. It is quite remarkable. In those cases, they are clearly helped by lawyers who are on their side, who take Enlightenment thought seriously and make cases that apparently convince the judge to set them free. So in those cases, it's probably uh, more on the side of the lawyers, but still, they do press the charges against their masters. So it's interesting to see this agency appear almost everywhere, and that's even before the revolution. So the free people of color in Saint Domingue, in French you call them the gens de couleur.
Mm.
These find themselves, of course, in a particular position. There's a book from the early 70s on free people of color throughout the Americas, and it has a very appropriate title. It's entitled Neither Slave Nor Free. And that, I think, describes the condition better than anything else, because yes, they have slavery behind, but does that mean they have the same rights as the whites?
Yeah.
And the answer is clearly no. There are all kinds of disabilities, and the disabilities actually even increase. In the case of Saint Domingue, I think it has to do with the fact that this is a relatively small colony, especially because it's also quite mountainous here and there, which means that you cannot really have plantations everywhere. And there was clearly among whites in Europe, lower class whites who wanted to make something of their lives, a desire to go to the colonies. This is, of course, everywhere in Europe up until, let's say the 1960s, when decolonization is finally successful in Africa. And that's the same in France. Now, in France, unlike in England, when you want to move to the colonies, now very limited possibilities. Yes, you can go to New France, but many people wanted to strike it rich, and then as a white person, you go to the Caribbean
Mhm.
because you can within a few years earn a massive fortune and live off it for the rest of your life. But Martinique is very small, Guadeloupe is very small, and then there are even tinier islands. Saint Domingue, on the other hand, very quickly, by the middle of the 18th century, certainly had the reputation of being such a lucrative colony from the perspective of you know, the empire, but also from the plantocracy. So that's where they wanted to go. Now, in the middle of the 18th century, we have the Seven Years' War, which ends in 1763. For the duration of the war, very few people could actually leave. And then finally, um, because of the warfare and the privateering going on. And finally, in 1763, there's a large batch of colonists that arrive only to find out that free people of color um, often have lands. So they have gathered enough money to buy some land, and they have made those lands into little plantations. Those are often those indigo plantations in the South. And what you see, and this is especially then the case in the cities where many of these recent European white immigrants arrive, there's a competition going on between the lower class of the whites and the free people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And it's these lower class whites who are often very eager to press the authorities, the people who can make the decisions, to make life hard for free people of color.
Mm-hmm.
So, you cannot walk alongside a white person as a free man or woman of color. You cannot, you should not be presented a chair when you visit them. So just, mean and nasty laws, but also laws that have more practical impacts, such as you could not um, live in town sometimes or open a shop in town. You could have a little stall, but not open a shop. And the rules are often quite similar to, let's say, the way that Jews and Muslims were treated in Spain in the early modern period. There's often remarkable parallels, even though there's, I don't think, any influence. They just want to make life very hard. So obviously, these free people of color have a bone to pick with not just the white population, but the way society is organized. And in Saint Domingue, we have the peculiar situation that some of these gens de couleur are very wealthy. So free people of color, I think we don't have the evidence for that, but I think it's not speculative to say that many of them would be the product of rape. There's a white man who's a planter, there's an enslaved woman, and the product is a free person of color, which means that if the child is a son, in many cases, the father might legitimize the son and might actually help him out with some startup money, which makes it easier to start a plantation. But what remains, despite the fact that the father may be white, what remains are these legal disabilities. So right before the Haitian Revolution begins, and the French Revolution has already started, there's a very wealthy planter, Vincent Auger, who goes to France, where there is now a French abolitionist society, and he doesn't really want to liberate slaves because that's against his own interests. In that sense, he has become white, he has become very successful, but at the same time, he wants to get rid of all the obstacles. So, and this Society of the Friends of the Blacks in Paris is, amenable to making those claims and defending them and having legislation change. And legislation will change in the years ahead. But it takes too long for him. He doesn't think he's very successful. He goes back and he actually starts a revolt in Saint Domingue in 1719, and he's killed during that revolt. But this is a very wealthy man. This man is not representative of the vast majority of, the women and men of African descent who happen to be free, but they're not really free. They still. So these people then are often literate, and that's a big difference from the slave population, and therefore they can read the French newspapers, and they immediately run with the slogans of the French Revolution, with the liberty, and certainly with the equality. And it's the equality that they emphasize more than the liberty, because when they're told we want to be free, the answer would be, well, you are already free. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for something more. So it's the language of equality. And let me, what I found in some of the, I have it somewhere here, in some of the documents that they author they have clearly looked at the language of that Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. That is often what comes back. So that the sixth article of the Declaration says, law is the expression of the general will. All citizens being equal in its eyes are equally eligible to all public dignities, places, and employments. Well, that's music to their ears. That's exactly what they're looking for.
Absolutely. And, would you say these motivations or strategies of free people of color did differ across the regions like the French Caribbean, Curacao, and the Spanish territories? Like, what were some of the factors that shaped these differences?
Yes, I do think it differs from place to place because you are still dealing with an empire with its own laws. And if you are, let's say, um, a resident of Jamaica, it makes more sense to appeal to legal precedents set in the colony, but also imperial laws. You can refer to abolitionist debates. And it's a little strange to appeal then to the French Revolution. I mean, you might do that to scare, your masters, and we know that songs were sung everywhere, including in Brazil, about first the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and it does scare them. Um, but that at the end of the day doesn't get you very far, of course. You really want to achieve something. And when I look at the campaign of the free people of color in let's say the British Caribbean, the 1790s are clearly very important,
Mhm.
but it's just one moment in time, and the battle continues. And we see time and again new campaigns that they have to engage into in order to achieve, at some point, voting rights, even, which is not something that, in the French colonies people were looking for because Britain, of course, had a parliamentary system, whereas France, up until the French Revolution, was just an absolute monarchy where only the king's voice counted. So this was not a culture that was used to voting. And,
Mhm.
and therefore it makes more sense in the British imperial context to make that a demand than in the French context, because even, yes, the French Revolution, by some yardsticks becomes very democratic. Everything and everybody is up for election. But of course, once Napoleon comes along, that's the end of it. And then Napoleon is defeated and it's back to being a monarchy.
Mhm.
And then for a few years, it's democracy and then it's an empire. So it's not really a democratic system at all. And therefore, it makes more sense in the British context to campaign um, for, you know, for different types of rights than within the French context.
And, we'll kind of stay on this in terms of the concept of cleanliness of blood played, a powerful role in structuring colonial societies. How did this idea affect the lives and, of course, the opportunities of free people of color? And why was it so, I guess, deeply embedded in the system?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think at the end of the day, there are various origins of this idea of cleanliness of blood. I mean, it's a term that's used in the Spanish colonies, limpieza de sangre. Um, I think one origin of this is the way that the nobility in Europe had always distinguished themselves from ordinary people. The idea that we have blue blood and the rest of the population is different. That's, I think, one origin. And to some extent, I think the racialized societies of the New World are indebted to that concept.
Mhm.
And there's some literature on that. There are some people who've written about New France, not so much in with respect to the relationship between whites and people of African background, but between whites and indigenous Americans. Um, it's a concept that also comes back vis-a-vis these indigenous Americans in places like Mexico, but also in British North America before institutionalized racism vis-a-vis slaves, vis-a-vis blacks in North America, because the initial encounter is with indigenous people. And the idea of many of the Europeans that arrive initially is that if we move to a different continent, we will be so much impacted by the climate there
Mhm.
that if our women give birth to children, they will look like Indians.
Mhm.
that was initially the idea. That's a continent where indigenous people are born. We will be completely different because of the climate, and in Europe people are different. That didn't turn out, of course, to be the case. And when they then look around and see that indigenous people are dying massively, obviously because of the disease factor, not immune to diseases that were quite common in Europe, like smallpox and measles, which every child in Europe had. It had completely disappeared from the Americas, so that leads to massive death toll wherever Europeans end up being in contact with indigenous people. But that confirms to the Europeans the idea that not only do they survive in other climates, but the very people who were born in this continent uh, tend to die in large numbers, which then prove their superiority and perhaps the purity of their blood. I think those are all um, elements to consider. But I think there's a French historian, Jean-Frédéric Chaube, who has drawn some lines between the policies in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain or Portugal, between the Catholic Spaniards on the one hand, and then the religious minorities on the other, the Muslims and the Jews, where, as I mentioned before, some of these similar ideas are being implemented. And let's say your grandparents were Jewish, but you are, a good Catholic. You go to mass, you observe the saints' days, you fast whenever it is required. You give your children, the Christian names, etc., etc. You are still considered to be a descendant of these people. You still have no pure blood, even 10 generations later. So you can never really shed it. And it's a variety of the one drop rule.
Yes.
Um, so it is something that at the end of the day is almost impossible to overcome. I'm not sure if in this article, this book chapter, I mentioned it, but in Curacao, what's interesting is that I think I said it in another article. By the end of the 18th century, there has been so much admixture, race mixture, that there are now free people of color who are not distinguishable on the outside.
Mhm.
And this becomes a problem because these people don't walk around with a passport saying I am 164th, black. I mean, it almost seems
Yes.
um, like the Third Reich, like the Nazi Empire, where these kinds of things were being discussed all the time. But it means that in practice they're saying, well, okay, if somebody is of this admixture, they have a particular legal term for it, we consider them to be white, simply because it was practically impossible. But that's, of course, a very small group we're talking about. At the end of the day, most free people of color still had to grapple with this, and there were always particular phenotypical traits that, either deservedly or not, made them be considered as being of African descent. So the example in Russia is Pushkin, the
Mm.
famous poet, whose I believe his grandmother had come from Africa, and because of certain traits, he was still, well, yes, we can see that you are of an African background. I think that happened all the time in these
Yeah.
racialized societies.
And, Professor Kluster, why was it often easier for light-skinned or free mulatto individuals to move up the social hierarchy? How did colorism intersect with class and legal status?
I think it is very clear that there was a difference, and we can see the difference in Saint Domingue, for instance, between the status of the free blacks and what they call the free, what's something called the free mulattoes, les mulâtres. So
Mhm.
the offspring or people with both white and black ancestry, let me call them that. This latter group was, of course, tended to be, not necessarily, but tended to be lighter skinned.
Mhm.
And they have the better jobs, they have the better chances in life. The very bottom of urban societies in Saint-Domingue, in places like Cap Français and Port-au-Prince, the very bottom of society are always the free blacks. Yes, there are enslaved blacks in the cities as well, but the free blacks tend to be so poor compared to certainly every other white person. And I think at the end of the day, your skin color showed your descent from
Hmm.
slaves, and the darker you were, the more likely it was that your slavery past was quite recent.
Mm.
I think in those societies, enslaved societies, where it is very easy to distinguish people simply on the basis of their skin color, um, it was such a clear marker. I think in general, in history, ethnicity has been very important to
Mhm.
distinguish between the the elites and the subalterns. So we know, for instance, that let's say you go around in the same period in the 1790s in Europe. In Romania, it's the Hungarians who are the nobility, who are the land-owning class. The serfs are the Romanians.
Mm.
In Silesia, in a part of what is now Poland, it's the Poles who are the serfs. It's the Prussians, the Germans, who are the landowners.
Mhm.
So that made it handy because you distinguish yourself simply by your language to distinguish. Um, in Russia, there was a problem because in Russia you have serfdom, but you also have slavery. And
Mm.
the slave owning class wanted at some point to distinguish itself from the enslaved class. And what they did was to invent an origin myth. So they said, we came from afar. In other words, we are actually a different ethnicity. Even though they spoke Russian, they were just as Russian. They didn't look any different from the people who worked for them. So ethnicity, therefore, is very handy. And what's even handier is if you don't even have to, ponder the question whether somebody is different because it's visible to for everybody to see.
Absolutely. And, we're just going to go on to the words back again. So, words carry immense weight in colonial societies. Would you be able to speak to the importance of titles like quote unquote Don and how language itself became a tool for claiming status and recognition?
I think it has to do with the fact that, and this you find, I think, everywhere there's a group that emancipates itself. So in the women's movement as well, at some point,
Mhm.
women, of course, begin to occupy jobs that up until that point were not available for women, and that was the case for most professions for a very long time. What you see in the beginning is that even if you know women just go about their jobs as any male colleagues, it's much easier for these men to call them proud
Mm.
or arrogant or hardy, um, because somehow they still have not accepted it. And you see the same with these free people of color. I wrote an article many years ago, more than 30 years ago now, about these free people of color in Curacao, and the title is Subordinate but Proud, and it's that pride that rubs the whites the wrong way, especially the lower class whites, because all of a sudden they have to face the fact that these people are not really that different from us, and they want to distinguish themselves. And what can they do about this? Well, they can always say, well, you are of slave background, and therefore, all the prejudices can then be listed. You come from a primitive continent, and there was no, idea of IQ, but often you find similar ideas being expressed. There's a limit to your civilization, etc. So, what I mentioned in this chapter is that there are certain free people of color who begin to call each other Don, which in the Spanish colonial context, and I believe this was in Louisiana
Mm.
when it was under Spanish rule, in the Spanish colonial context means sir. It's not, of course, always easy to translate everything from one language to another, but it does mean you are somebody that we look up to.
Hmm.
Sir means something different from today's world. Wherever I go here in the United States, people say sir. With my gray hair, it's very easy to say sir. It doesn't necessarily mean that they think that I am, socially superior. But in colonial society, there is a difference between ordinary people and those you can call sir. In the Spanish colonial context or in the Spanish context in Europe, somebody who has done before his name, Don Francisco Espejo, whatever their name was, uh, that meant that this was a person whose superiority we should acknowledge. Well, if free people of color start using those terms, there's a big contradiction because they can never deserve. This is, of course, the white idea. They can never deserve those terms. They can have achieved as much as they can list, like this Vincent Auger in Saint Domagane, but even he cannot be a don.
Exactly. And, you gave an example of Juan Bautista Olivares entering the priesthood, which challenges, of course, the racial and social boundaries. Why was this such a significant disruption to the colonial order? And what does it reveal about power and authority?
I think it reveals that there was a ceiling to what
Mhm.
free people of color could achieve in life. And there were certain positions. In Brazil, there are certain positions, I believe, like goldsmith or lawyer and physician, where it was simply legally impossible for anybody of African descent to enter. It's different in parts of Latin America, and I think it has to do in part with the fact that there are certain Spanish colonies where the black population is quite small, which means that
Mhm.
it's not felt as much as a danger as in slave societies, where certainly in the Caribbean, the overwhelming majority of the people are not just enslaved, but are black, or not just black, but enslaved. Um, so in Lima, in Peru, we know that there was a very significant percentage of physicians who were actually of mixed black and white descent, which is very interesting. So it does mean that they had gone to the university. But in most societies in the Caribbean, which are really slave societies, whereas Peru was never a slave society, perhaps up until 1542 under Spanish rule, and then indigenous slavery is abolished. But after that, it was certainly not a slave society. Um, After that, there is a necessary ceiling. I think there are two considerations on the part of the white elites. One
Mhm.
is that we should have some kind of a middle class between the white population and the slave population. And ideally, that should then be this group of free people of color. So it means that they have something to strive for. And it means that it's a kind of a buffer for
Mhm.
the white elite against the potentially very dangerous, for obvious reasons, um, slave population. But we should divide and rule. We should, keep them in different categories. So give some privileges, but not many. And at the same time, keep those who have to do the work, you know, enslaved for the rest of their lives as much as possible.
Yeah.
But it has to be kept as a class of its own. So it cannot be that there is uh, a route for them to end up in the upper class. I think that's an important consideration. And in the case of this Olivares in Venezuela, he was a musician and he had applied to be admitted to the priesthood. Well, the priests, what is the function of the priests in early modern societies? They're often the local ideologues, and that means that they have to, interpret the world according to the philosophy of the elites. How can that be a free person of color? That is, almost in itself impossible.
Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
what is interesting, this figure of Olivares who begins to do this in the 1790s, I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens um, in in the 1790s. There's there's another case I'm thinking about. There's an artisan. He's a native of Cuba, but he moves to Colombia, to Cartagena de Indias, which is this big port city on the Caribbean. And he, right before the independence movement begins in 1809 or 1810, writes a letter to the authorities where he advocates that his son be admitted to the university. He's a free man of color, and that means that his son is also a free person of color. Um, and it's denied,
Mhm.
obviously on the basis of racist grounds. A year later, the same man whose son was denied entrance to the university is the leader of a big revolt. Um, and they end up in the municipal building in Cartagena in the Indias, and they're instrumental in having the local authorities go along with the Declaration of Independence. So it's quite remarkable. So you can see him change. He has to play the game of the old regime, has to write a letter in a particular way, as we mentioned before, emphasizing certain values, certain virtues. Then when the independence war gets underway, the independence movement gets underway, he radicalizes and all of a sudden is all about equality. And he is successful in having some free men of color actually be part of that of the new elite for a while. So it's quite dramatic what happens in a very short amount of time.
So now in Curacao, there were free people of colors that sometimes aligned with the French revolutionary forces. What would motivate these alliances and how did they strengthen connections with the French Antilles?
So I would say it's even true for Curacao slave population that and there's an example of that. First of all, there's a big slave revolt in Curacao in 1795, which I think it's the year of more slave revolts in history ever, wherever you look. I don't think there's a year like that. It's fascinating, and I think it has a lot to do with the confluence of both the French and the Haitian Revolution. So, 1794, slavery is abolished in Saint Domingue by the French authorities, which is a process that actually begins with, um, you know, the agency of groups of slaves in Saint Domingue that finally then leads to the French Convention abolishing slavery. But 1795, there's a big slave revolt in Curacao. But what's remarkable about that revolt is that the free people of color side with the white authorities to help suppress the revolt. And there are some free people of color, but it's really a fairly small number that side with the revolt.
Mm-hmm.
And to just stay with the revolt for one moment, we have not too much information, obviously, as always, about what the rebels think, but we do have um, the um, the minister who is sent to negotiate by the authorities, the Protestant minister, and he reports back what the rebel leader has told him, and the rebel leader Tula tells him, and it's a very logical way of reasoning. He says, "The French have abolished slavery. The French have invaded the Dutch Republic, which is now French.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, slavery should be abolished here." It's a very logical way of reasoning, but it shows that he knew a lot about what was going on in Europe. As far from Europe as he was, and he knew what he was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that in his eyes, there was a natural alliance with the French, who might have been big exploiters of Africans, for a lot of years. It doesn't matter anymore. All of a sudden, there's a hopeful message coming from France. They have uh, determined that slavery is to be abolished, literally everywhere in the globe where there are French colonies, including in Asia. And Tola knew about this, and there was not much that the minister could say in response to that because it's such a clear reasoning. So there's another reason for free people of color to be in alliance with the French in the Caribbean, and that is partly because of the Haitian Revolution and the connection that they'd always had, but also because of what happens in Guadeloupe, where in 1794 a representative of the French Revolution arrives, Victor Hugues, a very complicated man, because on the one hand he was he had been a slave owner, on the other hand he's an abolitionist, and that's it's hard to square those, but he does try to actually both maintain the abolition of slavery in the colonies, but also continue the existence of plantation work. So what he tells the people who were working on the plantation, well, you are free, but the price you pay for your freedom is actually to continue working on the plantations. So trying to square the circle. But for practical purposes, what it means is that he begins a diplomatic offensive, and an offensive to lure to his side, especially enslaved populations in British colonies, because of the eternal war between the British and the French, by announcing that we will set you free. And it's not as if he had the means to occupy those islands, but he did want to destabilize the area. And it's not as if it's all pragmatic reasoning on his part. There is a part of him he's an idealist as well, and at the end of the day, he would like to see everybody free. It's just not possible now because he has to work within the confines of the French Empire, and they may have ended slavery. They don't want to end the plantation economies. And as we now know, that's impossible. Who wants to do that kind of backbreaking work as a free person? Um, so it's in that atmosphere, because he's there, I believe, from 1794 till 1802, that he operates, and he tries to do something that's completely impossible. But at least the messages coming out of Guadeloupe are very hopeful for people who are free, but not completely free, people of color in islands like Curacao. So that enables them to at least try to have some kind of a friendly relationship with French authorities.
Hmm. Now, I know that you mentioned before, in terms of with free people of color in Curacao, had a lot of access to move across the Caribbean. How did this movement influence the spread of ideas, resistance strategies, and political consciousness?
Again, it's very hard to say because we have so little that they wrote, even though many of these free people of color are literate. And I've seen contracts that they sign, and there's a way to distinguish between people who can only write their name, who for in every other way are illiterate, and those who write, as routinely. You can see that, and it's also, in Amsterdam in the 17th century, it's very clearly in wedding registers, you can see women who sign, you can see men who sign. Men are usually the ones who are literate. Women are not. It's more like a drawing. But many free people of color in Curacao can sign their name, and I think increasingly so. So because they're free, for them it's much easier to move around. And many of them growing up in a society like Curacao, where the port is of such great importance, because in a way, Curacao was a local variety of Amsterdam, of course, on a very much smaller scale, but it was in the 18th century, certainly in the beginning of the 18th century, one of the most dynamic ports of the Americas. And even by the end of the century, it's still a busy port with connections everywhere, which meant that ships were leaving every day. Small ships, sloops and schooners, one mast, two masts, but still, they had to be manned. And what we know is that already by, I believe, the 70s, 60s, 70s, 70s, something like two-thirds of the crews are non-white. And whenever you come across Curaçaos abroad in other colonies, it's by then, by the let's say the last quarter of the 18th century, so going into this age of revolutions, it's almost a given that they're free men of color. So that makes it clear that they do go around, and for every one that ends up somewhere in the archives because of some reason, There are, of course, so many more who are lost to history.
Yeah.
When they arrive in Saint Domingue, of course, they are very much aware of what is happening. And I think something completely unprecedented happened there in the Haitian Revolution. Um, that the slave revolt is successful, which had never happened in history. Spartacus had come a long way in the old Roman Empire, but a successful slave revolt in itself was saying quite something, I think, about black agency. Now, at the same time, of course, the Haitian Revolution is quite complicated because free people of color have their own interests and often side against, you know, the black populations. So it's not clear to me what free people of color actually thought about the complexity of the Haitian Revolution, because it's one historian once put it this way: the Haitian Revolution is, when you look at Saint Domingue in 1790, there's it's like a football game happening between two teams, and then all of a sudden in 1791 there's a third team that arrives on the field and is much larger and much more powerful than the other two combined. And it changes the dynamics completely, but it does not change the fact that those two initial teams are still there, and they're still there at the end of the Haitian Revolution, and it's still a very sad legacy that Haiti had to grapple with after 1804. The difference between, you know, the lighter skinned and the darker skinned, and that's a colonial legacy. So it's hard for me to say exactly what the Curacao and free people of color thought when they witnessed the
Mhm.
ever-changing sceneries of the Haitian Revolution, because every year is different.
Yeah.
It's much more. The Haitian Revolution is much more complicated than, say, the First World War, which is quite
Mhm.
straightforward. But the Haitian Revolution every year is different. So that's one thing. I think the message to slaves everywhere is it's possible. It's
Mhm.
possible. To me, the fact that 1795 sees so many revolts, yes, it is linked in part perhaps to the French Revolution and the turmoil in Europe and the hopeful messages of abolitionism, etc. But the fact that there was this, by now, by 1795, seemingly 4 years, unstoppable slave revolt. How many slave revolts had lasted for so long? Usually a revolt happens on one plantation and it's crushed very bloodily. Sometimes it goes into a few months. The second largest revolt in the Americas in the 18th century was Berbice in what is now Guyana.
Mhm.
That it started in, I believe, 1763, goes into 1764. But at some point it comes to an end. This one
Yeah.
simply wasn't stopped. And it, you know, it could still have been reversed. We know when Napoleon sent his men in 1802, they go very far in restoring slavery. But by 1795, I think it was quite hopeful to follow those events. Um, so in Curacao itself, what then happens is that in 1799, going 1800, there is a French invasion, and then it's very clear the French are the liberated. After all, they abolish slavery. This is before Napoleon restores slavery in the French colonies. So, from what we know, and again, there's very little that we know,
Mhm.
there was quite some turmoil among, the Curaçao slaves who sided with the French invaders. And what's also very clear on the flip side is that what happens then is international wide solidarity. This is something that has to be suppressed. So it's not the Curaçao authorities themselves cannot suppress this. So who do they call for? They call for the British and even North Americans, United States. So it's an international coalition that suppresses this. And that I think is telling. And it's almost foreshadowing what happens to Haiti when it becomes independent in 1804, when it becomes a pariah in the international community. Nobody wants to trade with them. So even if they wanted to export plantation products, they couldn't. It goes back to subsistence agriculture simply because it is a phenomenon that should be completely silenced. The idea that there is the product of a successful slave revolt as an independent country should just be ignored. So even when it's mentioned, it's still called in the British, British Caribbean newspapers in the United States, still called Santo Domingo, as if it's still not Haiti. The main port city, which used to be Cap Français, which was renamed by the revolutionaries, Cap Haitien, Haitian Cape, it's still called Cap Français in the newspaper. So um, this was something that the white plantocracies
Mm.
across international boundaries all agreed on. This has to be stopped at all costs. Not
Yeah.
for nothing were there English armies in Saint Domagane during the Revolution, Spanish armies, not just French armies.
Absolutely. And, would you be able to speak to some of, I guess, the key silences or gaps in the archival records when studying free and enslaved Black populations during this period? Like, how do historians work with these absences?
Yeah, it is something. I mean, we have to be very careful, of course, because it's clear that many people who study these slave societies they feel fully exploited. Um,
Mhm.
but we have to be very careful in putting words in their mouths. We have
Yeah.
to take them very seriously, and we should not assume a particular type of agency when it's not there. And therefore, you cannot assume automatically that they think the way, let's say, exploited elsewhere in another slave revolt think, if you don't really have proof for that. And what I've done, looking at slave revolts, is to go to the sources that we have. And the sources that we have obviously are very biased because they're all written down by clerks who sometimes, have to translate from, either a Creole tongue or an African language. And obviously a lot gets lost in translation or is abbreviated, is abridged, is simplified.
Mhm.
There's also the worldview of the transcriber of the interrogation with the Africans or the free people of color. Um,
Mhm.
but it's the closest I think we have to to finding their voice. So what I've done is in the case of slave revolts, slave revolts usually lead to an investigation, and an investigation leads to interrogation of people who were involved, who mention other names, and then they are questioned about what happened. And they can be, free or enslaved. They can be white. They can be black. All kinds of people are interrogated, and they don't know about the testimony of the others. But if you see a lot of, people who've taken part in these revolts say more or less the same thing,
Mhm.
even though it's through the lens of the white clerk, and even though they undoubtedly made these testimonies under quite some duress because they didn't know if they were going to survive. So they're certainly not going to give you the full picture. And if those testimonies are then confirmed by free people of color, if they give a similar idea, and free people of color who have not taken part, who might know something that the white authorities don't know. Or if, and it's sometimes the planter himself who said, well, I asked, let's say, my domestic servant who heard from the field hands that this is why they were rebelling, then I think we're getting closer to what was actually going on. So you have to be very careful, just like, the way historians have used Inquisition archives. You cannot, take it at face value, of course not. But there are ways, I think, to read between the lines and to, if you know something more about their background, the conditions in which they operate, what they might have been thinking when they were
Mhm.
doing this, to um, to reconstruct why they rebelled at this point and what their goals were.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, just one last question here in terms of, to what extent were the goals of free people of color did they ever align or in tension with those of enslaved populations? And how should we understand those kind of complex relationships?
Yes, well, it is indeed very complex because if you are a free person of color, you have white relatives, you have black relatives,
Mhm.
you have enslaved relatives, and you have very wealthy relatives, perhaps. Um, and I mentioned before, because of the color hierarchy, which in many ways is a class hierarchy, class and race often coincide, of course, in slave societies. Um, it depends on whether you were a free black or what they call the free mulatto. So if you are, completely of African backgrounds, all your ancestors are black, or whether there is some white admixture of whatever kind, which makes you seem whiter. Because that alone, simply the way you look, the way, and perhaps not just, phenotypically, but also the way you behaved, all of those things you could inherit, you could imitate. White people made a difference in these
Mhm.
societies. So, but so clearly there were free people of color who probably tended to be lighter skinned, who sided with whites, who wanted to be white. Whiteness was their goal.
Yeah.
And there were those who perhaps were on the lower side, who lived in neighborhoods. Sometimes they live on plantations, but when they live in the city, they live in the same neighborhoods as some of the urban slaves lived, who often, in this period, increasingly in the late 18th, early 19th century, live on their own, but they have to give whatever salary they have to their master, which is a major source of income for the master. So they live in the same neighborhood, which means they share the same lifestyle styles. And obviously they share the same ideas, right?
Mhm.
And the same ideals. So when it came to some revolts, I believe that is the one in Coro in Venezuela in 1795, it is a slave revolt, but it's also at the same time a revolt of free people of color. And at the same time that one of the demands is the abolition of slavery, there are also some demands about lower taxation, which is never a demand of slave populations for obvious reasons. So, and so it's in that sense, it's a little messy. We have pure
Mhm.
slave revolts, we have pure revolts of free people of color, but there are also those where you find a combination of the two. Um, and I think the one in Coro, if I remember correctly, in 1795 is a very good example. Certainly not the only one. So
Mhm.
sometimes they do end up together, but when you look at the list of demands, it's a mixture.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, as we come to a close to this discussion, Professor Kloster, what do you hope listeners take away from this period of rising expectations, and how should we understand the actions of free and enslaved Black communities within the broader history of the Caribbean and the Atlantic world?
It's not easy to answer that question, but let me try. I think from the perspective of people who either have lived their entire lives under the conditions of slavery, whose
Mm.
ancestors have lived under the conditions of slavery, there is very little hope in general.
Yeah.
So, yes, there is the possibility of perhaps reaching some agreement with the master whereby, in the course of many years, you gather enough money to set yourself free. There are good examples in Curacao of that as well, and it's often quite painful to see that. And it's often women who do that because it's the women who live with the children. Women, after 10 years, finally have enough money to pay off the master. And then you find them coming back over and over again because all those children are still languishing in slavery. So they keep working for that
Mhm.
purpose. Um, but the percentage of people who is able to do that, let alone those who are successful in doing that, is of course very small. Because
Yes.
slave societies wouldn't function if everybody had the opportunity to become free.
Mm.
So what happens here, um, from their perspective, is that an opening is created all of a sudden with the talk about kings in Europe who want to reform their countries in dramatic ways, and who even, in the case of the Spanish king, author a slave code, which means that there's a milder form of slavery, but for a long time it wasn't really known what was in the text, and when it's not known, well, anybody's guess is good. So, and you might think, well, the king starts talking about the slavery and the end of, or then it might well be the end of slavery. That's one thing. Then the other discussion would have been about the French Revolution. I mean, there's at least one reference to some people in Saint Domagane telling each other, well, the slaves or somewhere else in the Caribbean, the slaves in France have risen up.
Yeah.
That might be one. And then when you hear that slavery is abolished in French colonies, there's even more reason to think, well, this is our opening. And I think what then happens, and that's what this monarchical rumor I think is important. If you are really completely convinced that you have the king on your side, the authorities can say whatever they want. You have the king behind you. So that means you can, and if you're not given what the king has promised you, if you really believe that, then you can, move through all the walls and just in order to get what is legitimately yours. And of course, from a humane moral perspective, obviously we all think that they should have been given that, but they even think that it's according to the actual law.
Yeah.
So I think to them, perhaps even more so than to the free people called, this presents an opening that is very rare, and who knows when it may come again. We know what happened in France after in the French colonies after 1802 when slavery was restored. They have to wait all the way till 1848. So it means 2 whole generations living under those conditions. To the free people of color, who I think had more means to achieve for themselves some progress in life, it's also hopeful because there is now this new idea of complete legal equality, whereas under the old regime, wherever you look in the world, at least in the Euro-Atlantic world, the foundation of society was hierarchy, was order. And the language that you used in those letters to get a better deal for yourself always emphasized, well, but I'm an orderly person. I'll obey the authorities. Now, all of a sudden, the new ideal is freedom, equality. And equality to them is really important because they were supposedly already free, but they'd never been equal. Now that ideal is out there, well, to some degree, Pandora's box is open.
Yeah. Yeah.
And still, in the long run, of course, there's such a long struggle ahead for many of them. In Curacao, we have to wait till 1863 to be free. 1863, so many generations later. And I mean, elsewhere in the Americas, Cuba, 1886, Brazil, 1888. So it's still a very long struggle ahead. But there is an opening, and there are Haiti, significant groups of people who all of a sudden can live a life of freedom, however, curtailed it still is. But at least they're free. I'm always surprised, and I'm not sure if I mentioned in this article, but there's this wonderful list Wonderful for Historians, a list of slaves who absconded from Curacao and ended up usually in Venezuela because it was a short boat ride away. So they would steal a boat in port and just row their way to Venezuela. At some point in the 1770s, the authorities of Curacao say to the plantocracy, you can now come to us and say which of your enslaved workers has absconded at what point, and they can also say what their profession was, because generic slaves don't exist. They always have a profession. And most of them are field hands and toil very hard. But what's interesting is that there were a number of people then on the list, listed by these slave owners, who are musicians, a French horn player, a violinist. And that also strikes me in these runaway advertisements in North America. How many of them were fiddlers?
Yes.
So it means that you have a relatively, well, certainly a different life from having to work on the plantation every day. You can make music every day, and we know that they played Mozart in the Caribbean for the white guests that were entertained by the master. But even those people run away.
Yeah.
And why? Because they wanted to be completely free.
Yeah.
So even under those conditions where you can make music all day long, you still want to be free.
Yes, absolutely. And so I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Klooster, for coming on, because your article for me had a lot of themes that were very similar to what I've uncovered in my family history when it comes to free people of color and how they use the law to navigate themselves. And of course, the fact that they had ownership of people that were enslaved Africans, which made it very, as you said, it's a very complicated mix, and how we can't be able to kind of infer anything, but just take and see what we can be able to kind of come to a conclusion. But I do appreciate your time for coming on and speaking to this, because this, in my opinion, is one of the more important aspects in terms of when you're looking at your family tree and researching. So thank you so much.
You're perfectly welcome. It was my pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.